Good day, and welcome to the 14th lecture in our series of A History of Theology and Humor. Today we pick up with Benjamin Franklin, who inaugurated much of American humor. From Poor Richard's Almanac, he wrote, "I fear the man who drinks water, and so remembers this morning what the rest of us said last night." We are going to see what the rest of the people did last night and move all the way through the Babylon Bee in American humor and religion. So next we go to the great Broadway production, which is very relevant because it just follows Franklin, and that's Miranda's colonial and millennial Broadway hit, Hamilton. And in Hamilton, we see a bit of comedy coming out, particularly with Mad King George, da-da-da-da-da, but also with Aaron Burr's comment to Hamilton, "Smile more." Smile more came next to America when America smiled more in the Southwestern frontier humor. We find one of the great early authors of the 19th century, Johnson Jones Hooper, who created the adventures of Captain Simon Suggs. What we find is that next he creates this wonderful individualistic bravado of the American spirit, this great energy that comes from its ordinary men and women. And so he picked up from oral tradition, talking and swapping stories with journalists and lawyers, this idea of Captain Simon Suggs. Now, he is a conniving, swindling scoundrel. He belongs in Washington, D.C., but he's actually down there in Alabama. But he is also one who will unmask pretenses. In fact, next we find that one of his more outlandish adventures comes when the captain needs some cash and he stumbles upon a backwoods camp meeting. And this meeting is a revival, one of the best revivals. So he watches the preacher kind of boast on a new convert. "I took him first in the Old Testament, bless the Lord, and I argued him all the way through Kings. Then I throwed him into Proverbs. And from that, here we had it up and down, clear down to the New Testament. Bless my poor old soul," screamed the preacher as the pulpit as he looked for new converts all over. And then he hears another voice, kind of a sensual seeming man, says, "Keep the thing warm." Now, this man, a very stout mold and florid countenance, he was exhorting a bevy of young women, upon whom one he was lavishing quite affectionate caresses. "Keep the thing warm, breathing. Come to the Lord, honey," he added as he vigorously hugged one of the damsels he sought to save. Well, next he says he sees an old woman there, and she's a large, huge, greasy woman. And she goes, "Glory," as in a fit of jerks, and throws herself convulsively from her feet and falls on the floor like 1,000 of bricks. Except she falls upon this diminutive old man in a little round hat and basically crushes him. Now Suggs sees the preacher officiating among all the gals and never said the first word to nobody else. He wonders, what's the reason these here preachers never hugs up the old ugly women? Never seen one of them do it in my life. The Spirit never moves them that way. Well, I judge if I were a preacher, I should save the prettiest souls first myself. Now, Simon Suggs will be picked up later on by Mark Twain in Huckleberry Finn to kind of demonstrate what his con men are like. We move next to George Washington Harris, who is very similar. And he creates, instead of Suggs, his Sut Lovingood. And he is another trickster figure in early American literature. And down in the Appalachian backwoods, they tell their tales, they spin their yarns, and they go on. Now, next, Sut Lovingood was a natural born fool. He is that American trickster who drinks whiskey, chases girls, pulls revenge pranks. If you get him, he's going to get you back. And he exposes sham circuit riders. All of these people who, after Asbury, didn't take their job as seriously as Francis did. In fact, Flannery O'Connor found Harris to be one of America's best grotesque writers, using kind of natural dialects to capture what was there. And Cormac McCarthy, the great writer, gives the name of one of his protagonists, the novel Sutra, as Sut. Sut Lovingood. Now, where we see Sut next is going to another revival. And in this revival, it's called Parson John Bullen's Lizards. Sut is beat up with a club by Parson Bullen. And Bullen is this fire and brimstone preacher, and he catches the rascal frisking horizontally in a huckleberry thicket with a girl at the camp meeting. The preacher told them and warns them how the old hell serpents would starve them if they didn't repent, how cold they'd crawl over their naked bodies, and how they on to pitch they'd stick to them like they crawled, and how they'd wrap their tails round their naked choking cloths, poke their tongues up their noses, and hiss into their yars. And so their ears would open. And next we find that he wants to get back at it. And so what Sut does is while Bullen is preaching to his large crowd, he doesn't realize that Sut is releasing several pot-bellied lizards up his pants leg. And they crawl all the way up Bullen's legs, which prompts him to strip off all of his clothes in terror, just as in his sermon. And so this is how Sut gets back at some of these people. Now next, both Suggs and Sot belong in Puck's. Puck magazine was the great satire magazine that kind of existed for about 30, 40 years at the end of the 19th century. And Puck kind of created this caricature of a camp meeting sketch. And so it chronicles some of the excesses of these enthusiastic revivals. And what this lithograph kind of portrays is how money, sex, and religion kind of intersect and interact with one another. And so you find a little church rum whiskey down here. You find hymn brandy. You find a barrel of exalted devotion with a spigot so you can drink straight from the source. And you find in the background this love-making feast tent. And this is all for the cause of Christ. Of course, it could be just an Episcopal retreat, but there's too much enthusiasm for that. Next, we find another character who was Abraham Lincoln's favorite author. This is Artemus Ward, also known as Charles Sparrow Brown. Now, his parents were prominent citizens, but the townspeople weren't so sure of Charlie. And they thought he'd come to some bad end. He just didn't like to work like any other teenager. He preferred to lie around and put on circuses. In fact, he would dress up a cow and call it an elephant, and people would actually pay to see his elephant. But we find it next that President Lincoln read Ward's Outrage in Eutyche. Eutyche is a place where they bring some wax statues of Judas and disciples, and Judas has his head smashed in. But just before Lincoln read and issued the Emancipation Proclamation, he read this wonderful little short story to get him in a laughing mood. Artemus Ward has given us some great axioms that we probably all know and recognize from other politicians. When a fellow says it ain't the money, but the principle of the thing, it's the money. Or he said, I've given 2 cousins to war, and I stand ready to sacrifice my wife's brother. Ward was a master of aphorisms. And we find next that he's known for slinging ink, for throwing his writing at people or at ideas that needed. And he was actually better on stage than on the page. He would influence people like Mark Twain. And he actually became America's first stand-up comedian. Now, Artemus Ward wrote one story next, where he talks about a young boy that goes to court in Arkansas. He was only 14 years old, and one night he had deliberately murdered his father and mother in cold blood with a meat axe. He was tried and, of course, found guilty. And the judge drew on his black cap, and a voice choked with emotion asked the young prisoner if he had anything to say before the sentence of the court was passed on him. "Why, no," replied the prisoner. "I think I haven't, though I hope your honor will show some consideration for the feelings of a poor orphan." The boy who had made himself an orphan, ironically, bases his whole defense on the fact that he is now an orphan. But next we find that Artemus Ward would travel around the country and over to Britain and other places. In fact, we find him in this one kind of cartoon introducing himself to Mr. Punch, the great kind of cartoonist image and icon of Punch magazine. And he would go in his travels from one place to the next and the next. In fact, he used all these kind of drolleries. The drolleries next that you find is he goes and he visits the Shakers of the Mormons. When he goes to the Shakers, he sits with the Shaker women and they say, yay. And he says, okay, I yayed it. He kind of fools around with them, much like the people at the revivals. But some of his great drolleries, his kind of great sketches and kind of short comedies, it goes when he goes and visits to the Mormons. And he finds all kinds of women, and particularly this tall, gaunt female coming at him. Next, you find that he really recorded his travels among the Mormons. He wrote, Joseph Smith did a more flourishing business in the profit line than Brigham Young. Smith used to have his little revelations almost every day, sometimes 2 before dinner. BY only takes 1 once in a while. But even more next, when he gets among the Mormons, he finds that on arriving at Salt Lake City, he's claimed by nearly a half-dozen fair Mormon ladies. But after the sealing, after he's sealed, each of the fair creatures wants their share of the bold showman. Of course, at dinner time, Artemus is scolded by his wives for not providing food for his family. Under the circumstances, he's not very jolly. And then one of the elders comes before him and looks at the atrocity of his conduct in not really supplying all the needs of his family. And so here we have the issue of polygamy coming up and Artemus Ward taking it and playing with it in the public press. Now next he said, when I saw Brigham Young's mother-in-law while I was there, I saw her at Salt Lake City. I can't exactly tell you how many there is of her, but it's a good deal. It strikes me that one mother-in-law is about enough to have in a family, unless you're very fond of excitement. But next, he was supplanted by the most famous man in America, the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, the preacher of Plymouth Congregational Church. Now, next we find with his famous sister, Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote, of course, Uncle Tom's Cabin and was really part of the abolition movement. The Reverend was renowned as well for his very dramatic abolitionist sermons. For example, he would plead for money to set a slave child free. And we find next that he would take this little girl, Pinky, in his Plymouth church, and he would smash the chains and auction the little girl off. And the next thing we find, too, is that he deals with all of this in such a way that it becomes almost a circus. In fact, Puck Magazine began to caricaturize his religious revivals as circuses. But he also made a lot of money for it. And you find that people are carrying around an offering box. And it says, he who lendeth to the Beecher giveth to the Lord. And so here you have this wonderful kind of circus atmosphere of churches, this religious revival that has come to urban centers. But Beecher did give us a lot next about humor. And he basically said good humor makes all things tolerable. And he gave us what would really be kind of known as a creed about humor from a religious perspective. He wrote, life is full of amusement to an amusing man. Happy is he who has this faculty. It is more blessed than a garment in cold weather. There is nothing that so covers the nerves. There is nothing that so tempers the anger and passion. There is nothing that is such a natural cure for discontent. There is nothing that brings men to such a companionable level and creates such fellowship as the divine sense of mirth. He says next, when he cracked his jokes, as one biographer tells us, there were polite titters from the more costly pews, from the sophisticated people. But there were loud guffaws from the galleries. The people loved him. And he complained, there are some people that are so dry that you might soak them for a joke for a month. It would not wet them through the skin. And he warned that a person without a sense of humor is like a wagon without springs. It's jolted by every pebble in the road. Now, all of this was very funny and very comic and a good sense of what was going on. But what we find next is that Victorian trial of the century came with Beecher. And this is before O.J. Simpson. This is before all the televangelist scandals. And the New York saying used to go, mankind is divided into 3 classes, the good, the bad, and the Beechers. And Henry Ward Beecher would create one of the great scandals of all time. In fact, next we find that he allegedly had an affair with a woman in his congregation, Mrs. Tilton. And Mrs. Tilton told her husband, Joseph, that she had had the affair. Joseph Tilton then goes on to Stanton, one of the leaders of the women's movement. And remember, Beecher was ahead of the American suffrage organization. He was a great advocate of women's rights. But he goes to one of the other women and kind of confides that Beecher's been fooling around with his wife. And so then she goes to Victoria Woodhull, the first woman to run for president. And Victoria Woodhull begins to kind of realize that she's got something on Henry Ward Beecher. Now, part of her platform in running for the president is free love. And so she's going to recognize that he is a hypocrite because he comes out against her and her platform of free love. And he is actually practicing free love in his own congregation. Where that leads us to next is one of the great trials where the American Congregational Cleric is put on trial in Brooklyn in 1875 and having committed adultery with Mrs. Tilton, a member of his congregation. This leads next to just scandal in the press. And of course, the jury is hung. Nothing is really decided on this, but still, the taint of this adultery goes with him. In fact, it is so strong that Puck magazine next begins to kind of realize that politics, religion, and satire are coming together. And the eager Beecher comes to the Republican Party girl, and he says, I'm offering you my services. But even the Republicans this time say, I must decline your escort, sir. My reputation is bad enough already. And so next we find the defeated saint who is there from his Plymouth Congregational Church, standing next to John Taylor in his tabernacle at Salt Lake City, the third leader of the Mormons. And all the women are there kind of praising and lamenting the fact that their leader has fallen, but they're still devoted to him. And so you get this kind of strange sense of women supporting these guilty men. Puck magazine next takes on another caricature of him, where they say, he lives large on sausage and wine. For others, just bread and water are fine. Beecher next joins kind of a who's who and meets kind of Ingersoll in the gospel tent. And they're both seen as natural cranks. But it's kind of a strange bedfellows where we find Beecher, who is this congregational preacher, and next we find Robert Ingersoll, who is known as the great agnostic. Now, the late 19th century is known as the golden age of freethinkers. And what we find next is Ingersoll becomes one of their leaders. His creed comes out and he says, happiness is the only good. The time to be happy is now. The place to be happy is here. The way to be happy is to make others happy too. And so this idea of the individual, of the great human being in control of his or her life comes through Ingersoll. But Ingersoll continues on and begins to debunk religion. What we see next is that he says, the idea to hate men and worship God seems to be the sum of all creeds. He gathers some of the largest crowds that you will find during this time. And he writes so many pamphlets and books. For example, next you find that he writes about the gods and other lectures. And in this, he writes that you can banish me from Eden when you will. But first, let me eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. And during this time of the American Enlightenment, science was pitted against religion. But these atheists are seen as good teachers of the Christian faith because they point out to us what Christians begin to neglect about their own faith and tradition. They raise issues and similar questions and problems that the Hebrew prophets and Jesus actually did practice. But here we find, even in the image that we see in this book cover, we see three crosses, which are the way that religious people kind of persecute others. And for humans, what we have done is create progress. And so we see those crosses can be made into telephone poles, means of communication. And progress comes against tradition. And so next we begin to look at Ingersoll. And Ingersoll believes that the history of intellectual progress is written in the lives of infidels, those who don't believe. Of course, it's very selective, and he looks at people like Voltaire. But we find that there are many Christians who do kind of ask these questions and answer them and address them. And so the key question that comes in looking at people like Ingersoll and Voltaire is we ask what is true and what is fabricated in the atheist critique of Christianity. What can we learn from their satiric attacks on this traditional faith? For example, we look and we find his quotation, "Why should I allow that same God to tell me how to raise my kids who had to drown his own?" Where he looks at the story of Noah and gives his own kind of interpretation, however skewed, to that story. But we look at Ingersoll on the cover of The Truth Seeker, the idea that reason will solve all of our problems. And he is the one who champions science over what he calls religious superstition. And we find again this whole kind of agnostic or atheist tradition with Voltaire. Next, we find that his popularity was so strong that in one of the illustrated newspapers, we find that he can hold his services on Sunday, proving that there is no God, or trying to, when the Museum of Natural History is closed because it might offend morality. There's a great irony of American culture at this time. But next we find that the great caricaturist Thomas Nast, one of the great people, the great kind of artists and illustrators, creates this wonderful cartoon of Robert Ingersoll in one hot summer. And here he's reading a question, is there a hell? You're never quite sure. It gets a little hot. And it ends with kind of this last image, next image of his obituary. Ingersoll dead, says the New York Times. And ironically, it puts as the subtitle, the great infidel called to meet his God. Now, of course, the New York Times would never say that today, but it's very funny back then. Next, we look at Ingersoll and a bunch of friends, Napoleon, Charles Darwin, P.T. Barnum, Benjamin Franklin, Brigham Young, Voltaire, all on their way to hell. And it's a whole kind of dancing review line coming out of Hamilton itself, where Mark Twain had once said, heaven for climate, hell for company. And there are a lot of fascinating, rascally characters that Mark Twain sees down there. In fact, like next, let's go to a kind of a couple images, cartoons of the problem of getting into heaven or going to hell. In one, we have an atheist standing before St. Peter, and the gates of heaven say, no atheist. And of course, the atheist says, I don't believe it. Worse is the heaven for agnostics. An agnostic asks, are you going to let me in or not? And Peter says, no, I'm not sure. And so how apt these both are. But we get next to the great cartoonist Gary Larson, who defines and illustrates the afterlife through his Far Side cartoons. When you go to heaven, you get a harp. When you go to hell, you get an accordion. And everyone has an accordion. Or next, the last cartoon is we find that rock and roll souls are having a difficult dilemma. There is the stairway to heaven, but there's also the highway to hell. And whoa, dude, it's a bummer. But the fact that there's a highway to hell and only a stairway to heaven says a lot about anticipated traffic numbers. Next, we come back to Thomas Nast. And Thomas Nast will create this idea that the pen is mightier than the sword, that his ability to draw and create characters is going to be much more powerful than anyone realizes. And we move next to the fact that he is the one who created for us the idea and the icon of Uncle Sam. U is for Uncle Sam, don't forget to mention. He is not a real man, but an old cartoon invention. And we thank Thomas Nast for that. On the other side, Thomas Nast is the one who creates the images of the Republican elephant and the donkey for Democrats. He has given us these great political icons that we still laugh at today. And even if you look at me beside me, here is Uncle Sam kind of standing here. He is my friend, but he has come from Thomas Nast. Now, next we go to one of his really religious satires. And this was part of the xenophobia, the fear of foreigners that we find in the latter decades of the 19th century. And he draws the American River Ganges, where we see these mitred crocodiles, these bishops who are coming ashore. We find all of the Roman Catholic immigrants coming into the kind of Protestant places of New York and New England. And so we're holding back our children, afraid for our children because these creatures are coming up. Next, we find there are other cartoons that also deal with this. In fact, it was Pope Pius IX who first convened the First Vatican Council, and he decreed papal infallibility. And so he points with his bishops and his monks and his Jesuits to the United States across the Atlantic. And you see the fear of this kind of invasion of Roman Catholics coming over and beginning to kind of control. Where this came next is we find the xenophobia kind of attacks on small areas too, where people who would come into confession would tell their secrets. And if they were Congress people, or if they were politicians or state people or businessmen, their confessions would go directly back to Rome. And you have all of these kind of mass confessions that there is a conspiracy, this kind of really perverse kind of fear that comes there. And next we find with these increasing waves of immigrants from Ireland, Italy, and Poland, there is this strong era of anti-Catholicism rooted in theological differences. Remember, the Reformation has happened and is still kind of happening. And the religious wars in Europe, the Catholics and the Protestants going on and on. People began to believe that the Pope was the Antichrist with the whore of Babylon. And so Americans feared these grand shadows of the Roman Catholic Church coming over and the political control. And we find this even occurred in the 1960s when John F. Kennedy ran for president, and the fear that he would somehow be told what to do by the Pope. But next we find that the ordinary people are more concerned too about the sermons being given in the Protestant churches. And many of the sermons dealt with sensational material. There's an old style Christian says, where, oh, where can I go to hear a little plain everyday religion preached? Because people are talking about divorces. They're talking about fear. They're talking about everything sensational except about the Gospels. Now, next we go to kind of Puck magazine. And Puck really kind of creates a strange kind of cultural barometer. And here in this cover, we find this screw-tape little red devil hiding among the garden of white Easter lilies. And lilies, of course, represent, according to a kind of the pious legend where they grew up after the death and resurrection of Jesus, this kind of idea where the blood of Jesus grew up. But among all of these lilies, we still find the presence of the devil. And next we find in a whole series of covers from Puck magazine, this strange combination where we have comely lasses in their Easter bonnets, along with Easter eggs, little rabbits and bunnies, and tonsured monks who are wondering what's going on. We find that Easter is being taken over by a secularized culture, that religion is being pushed to the background, that Easter, like Christmas with Santa Claus, has been taken over by everything that is not religious during this era. Next, we come to one of the great and most familiar of characters, and that's Samuel Clemens, who is known, of course, as Mark Twain, that variable, amiable man in the white suit and his jumping frog. Now, we find next that Twain, in his early days, had a lot of wit about humor, and particularly about Presbyterians. And he looks at man as a religious animal, and he's the only animal that has the true religion, several of them. But he's the only animal that loves his neighbor as himself and then cuts his throat if his theology isn't straight. We find that Twain moves through the tragedies of his life, the death of his daughter, the death of his wife, become more and more cynical. And so next we find at the end of this Gilded Age that Twain believes in laughter. He says laughter cannot be suppressed. And it's catching. It's contagious. Sooner or later, it will wash away our defenses and undermine our dignity, and we join in it. It's good for us. It makes us ashamed of our weaknesses and embittered against the cause of the exposure. But no matter, we have to join in with laughter. Laughter is good for us. There's no hope for us. In fact, in one of his kind of darker satires later on, he realized that in the poverty of our lives, in the sin of our lives, the human race has only one effective weapon, and that is laughter. To laugh at ourselves creates this humility. But near the end of his life, we find next that he writes letters from earth, and he writes Captain Stormfield's Visit to Heaven. And in these sets of writings, he begins to look more cynically at the human animal. And he sees us all as being insane. All animals are insane. The earth is insane. And we are a sarcasm. We think that we are the creator's pet. And so he sees when things go bad from his former Presbyterian kind of predestination, how can these things happen? He gets to a place next where when America is about to look and go into the war, he writes his war prayer because he sees this hatred in religious people. And so he creates this parody of a prayer, this mock prayer. He looks at people praying for the death of their enemy. He says, "O Lord our God, help us to tear their soldiers to bloody shreds with our shells. Help us to cover their smiling fields with the pale forms of their patriot dead. Help us to drown the thunder of their guns with the shrieks of their wounded." His war prayer is one of the great exposures of the hatred of us that we have for our international neighbors. Now, another person who took up this same mantle was Ambrose Bierce, and he is next. And he is also in the golden age of freethinkers, and one of the cleverest people and one of the greatest cynics that would find. He was a Civil War hero. He wrote The Occurrence at the Owl Creek Bridge, as you may remember. He was a Hearst colonist, and Hearst kind of pushed him out there all the time, but he was also a gadfly. And he wrote a book called The Cynic's Word Book that would become the Devil's Dictionary. In fact, next, if you look, the true function of wit for him was to make one not writhe with merriment, but with anguish. He said he would shoot his venomous quills into the eyes of specific individuals. He thought that it's not enough to hate the sin and love the sinner. We need to also punish the sinner, and he would name them. But some of his little definitions in the Devil's Dictionary are quite clever. Church, for example, is a place where the parson worships God and the women worship the parson. And you think, again, of Beecher and the Mormon Church. Or a clergyman. A clergyman is one who undertakes their management of our spiritual affairs as a method of bettering his temporal ones. Preachers, for him, are birds of prey. They haunt us and they take our carcasses. Next, his great line about love. It's a temporary insanity which is curable by marriage. His marriage was not too good. And pray is to ask the laws of the universe be annulled on behalf of a single petitioner, confessedly unworthy. And so there's wit in there, but there's also cynicism. And we find next that the great kind of horror writer, H.P. Lovecraft, looked at Bierce's Devil's Dictionary, and he said, that sort of thing wears thin. For when one cynicism becomes perfect and absolute, there is no longer anything amusing in the stupidity and hypocrisy of the herd. It is all to be expected. What else could human nature produce? But irony annuls itself by means of its own victory. Now, along with Twain at the end of his life, Ingersoll and Bierce, there's next kind of a whole group of village atheists. And Lee Eric Schmidt kind of wrote about these unbelievers, how they made their way. And so he looked at the kind of biographies of several outspoken infidels, such as the rough-edged cartoonist Watson Heston and the atheist sex reformer Elmina Slenker. Now, she advertised for a husband in the newspaper, and she advocated what she called spiritual eroticism, or Dianaism, from the kind of the temple of Diana. And because she wanted people to conserve the life forces and not needlessly waste them in mere paroxysms of pleasure. Of course, no one really needlessly wasted them with Slenker, the poor little lady on the bottom left. But we look at Heston in particular next, and he created this very kind of darkly humorous Old Testament, comically illustrated, and his New Testament. And here he has kind of God breathing the life into this kind of clay of Adam. And so he takes literal verses and he puts them in kind of distorted ways. We can see that next, where he has Jesus on a pinnacle, and the devil takes him up on the holy city and asks him if he will just kind of throw himself down. But what you notice in this picture and the next one is that Jesus is very it's almost an anti-Semitic caricature with a large nose and the hair. And Jesus is seen as full of nonsense, this Nazarene. And so one of his disciples says to him, "Lord, suffer me first to go and bury my father." And Jesus tells him something that Heston sees as very stupid. Follow me and let the dead bury the dead. And you see the kind of skeletons in the background. And for Heston, this is very ridiculous and full of nonsense. What you find next is that he has kind of a hermeneutic, a way of interpreting scripture that is secular but fundamentalist. In fact, the verse when Jesus says, "If your right hand offend thee, cut it off." And so what Heston does is he interprets the scriptures literally and has the man cut off his right hand. And he looks next at the angels in heaven, the saints. The angels are there looking down at the destruction of the world and being amused by them. And so we find this kind of dark cynicism about the church, which may have deserved a lot of this at the end of the 19th century. But we find that this kind of anger and hatred is there. Now we move to the last kind of iconoclast next, who is a very, very funny man, H.L. Mencken, kind of the journalist. He kind of observes human life and religious life, and he sees how politics are wrapped up with religion. And he says if a politician found he had cannibals among his constituents, he would promise them missionaries for dinner. Next, we find he's very mischievous, and during the Prohibition, he loved his beer, and after the Prohibition, he celebrated the fact that he could get his beer back. But he understood his own role, and he said, a cynic is a man who, when he smells flowers, looks around for a coffin. And Mencken looked for the coffin. Next, he looked in some of the things he said about religion. He says the chief contribution of Protestants to human thought is the massive proof that God is a bore. You go to their sermons, they'll put you to sleep. And if we can assume that man actually does resemble God, then we're forced into the impossible theory that God is a coward, an idiot, and a bounder. He has taken the idea that man is made in the image of God and reversed it and made God in man's image. And Sunday, he defines, much like Ambrose Bierce, a day given over by Americans to wishing they themselves were dead and in heaven, and that their neighbors were dead and in hell. And one that was probably most apt, even into our century, is that Sunday school is a prison in which children do penance for the evil conscience of their parents. Let's send them to Sunday school. Fortunately, I think that has changed. Next, we find that he covered the Tennessee Scopes trial, the trial on teaching Darwinism in public schools. And here we have Darwin kind of caricatured as a monkey and the whole evolution of man. And we look next to kind of comically of how this happens. We find the evolution of a man and a woman. And first, the evolution of humor, where a man just goes up and throws the banana peel down. But we find that the evolution of a man and a woman, one of us evolves much more quickly than the other. The other of us stays pretty much the way we have always been. But in this whole trial, we find next that Mencken wrote The Hills of Zion. And he sees the hypocrisy of people, kind of the upright Protestants here in Tennessee. People like William Jennings Bryan, who really didn't know his Bible as well as he did. And you find this kind of religious orgy going on where people are full of damnation for the other side. And now, Bryan and Clarence Darrows were friends and would interact with each other. And you find next that there is this kind of fundamentalism versus liberalism, secularism, that really is kind of a false dichotomy coming up, but it kind of creates this chasm between the two. And you'll find that fundamentalists will leave kind of the culture wars after they even win the trial, but they lose in the public press that goes on there. Next, we find that what would a verdict be like if really we had a bunch of monkeys there? And this is what people felt like the jury was made up of anyway, all of these monkeys. Next, we find this great film by Stanley Kramer, Inherit the Wind, which distorts a lot of the facts. In fact, Gene Kelly, as Mencken, plays Mencken in the sense, he says, the duty of a newspaper man to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. Unfortunately, Mencken didn't say that. It was Mr. Dooley, Finley Peter Dunne, the great humorist of the early 20th century, who wrote, the newspaper does everything for us. We can think today, the media. It runs the police force and the banks, commands the military, controls the legislator, baptizes the young, marries the foolish, comforts the afflicted, afflicts the comfortable, buries the dead, and then roasts them afterwards. So Mr. Dooley had this kind of great quote of the fact of what this is doing. But the film kind of takes a lot of freedom and license with the facts and distorts it. We end next with Mencken's idea that life is a dead-end street. And if there is no faith, it is a dead-end street. If there is no hope, it is a dead-end street. But he may have had a little wisdom when he said that men have a better time of it than women. For one thing, men marry later. For another thing, we die earlier. But we leave that next and we find the last thing that Mencken has given us, that his job was to heave dead hats into sanctuaries. Because once you put a dead cat into somewhere, the whole conversation changes. And that's what he did. We end up next to the modern time to looking at a study showing that most Christian theology today about hell is based on Far Side cartoons. Of course, this comes from the great religious site, the Babylon Bee. In fact, if we look next at a couple of Far Side cartoons, we find first that they're down in hell, and one of them saying, oh man, the coffee's cold. They thought of everything. And on the other side, the devils gather in the front office and they look at the suggestion box and laugh diabolically. Now, following that, there is the Wittenberg Door, which is next. And the Wittenberg Door started as kind of a mad magazine for the church. And it was a satirical magazine with fake news of the day. It would create theologians of the year, like Mr. T or Woody Allen, people that the magazine thought were really controlling the cultural mind rather than the scriptures. And they would have a cartoon series called Dogs Who Know the Lord, dogs who can pray and do other kinds of religious duties. But the great thing about it was they would have very serious interviews that were very funny with people like Frederick Buechner, Dave Barry, Stan Freberg, Will Willimon, Malcolm Muggeridge, Henry Newen, Virginia Stem Owens, Mr. Fred Rogers, and Billy Graham, and show the humor and the faith of all of these people. Next, if you look at some of the covers, you have what we were kind of this mad magazine, Alfred E. Newman, but it's also kind of a commentary on Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth, the man who prophesied in the late 60s that we were in the end times and the whole common market was part of the Antichrist. But of course, he invested a lot of his money in futures and has retired very profitably. But here we see Woody Allen or we see Napoleon Dynamite. And so they would take culture and let us see. One of the great parodies next is when the Wittenberg Door did their swimsuit issue in the Holy Land and took ordinary looking women and kind of made a parody of Sports Illustrated, but also of our fascination with women in bathing suits. Next, we come to the last several things, and that's the Babylon Bee. This is the site today, which is making kind of lots of fun for us. It has been even kind of recognized by CNN as fake news, and they were worried because they thought it was a fake news site and didn't understand that it was a satire site. It was there. And so in the first image here, we have a wife's prayer for her husband to stop watching sports all the time because that resulted in a global pandemic. None of us get to watch sports anymore. But the last one is the church adds a laugh track after the pastor's joke. And that's what your lecturer needs now, a laugh track. If only I had a laugh track, this would be so much funnier. Next week, we go to the British and we end up with them and then finally meeting C.S. Lewis and Stephen Colbert. See you then.